This lesson is entitled Elevate, Rising Above the Sufferings of this World. This is being produced because, like so many places, the congregation here in Benton Harbor has had to cancel services for the sake of safety and well-being. And I want to share with our members something. Hopefully we'll be able to post this and they'll be able to go and look at it, possibly even Sunday morning when they're at home. We want to make it clear, however, that virtual church, just signing onto a computer, is not the same as assembling. It is not wrong for us to suspend our assembling for the sake of safety and health and well-being, especially for the safety and health and well-being of our community and our country. We have always held that when people are sick or when people are taking care of others who are sick, or in an effort not to get sick, that the obligation to assemble bows to these needs. It is not an unscriptural thing, then, to follow the guidelines that our governmental leaders have set forth in this matter. And it is a temporary thing. When this is over, we need to go back to assembling together, to do the things that we can do only as we are together, to greet one another, to teach and admonish one another in songs, to share together in the Lord's Supper, and to give our funds for the work of the church, those kinds of things. We need to get back to those. But right now, we're in the middle of what seems to be a world crisis, and I don't know how serious it is. I don't know how serious it may become. We have to trust in God and know that He has promised, I will never leave thee nor forsake thee, so that we may boldly say, the Lord is my helper. I will not fear what men shall do to me. Ours is the shepherd that we can count on so that we do not want. Psalm 23 and verse 1. We need to remember that this coronavirus, this COVID-19, is not as serious at this point, nor does it look like it will get as serious as some of the plagues that we can read about in history. We can go back to Numbers chapter 16, verses 46 through 50, where it talks about 14,700 people who died in a plague there. In Numbers 25, when the people of Israel had committed fornication with the daughters of Moab, God sent a plague there, and 24,000 people died. In 2 Samuel 24, when David had sinned by numbering the people, and God sent a plague there, it says that 70,000 people died in that plague. The plague of Justinian, AD 541, it is estimated that some 30 to 50 million people died in that plague. The Black Death, 1347, although it went on for about 4 years, there were about 200 million lives lost. It was in that Black Death plague that quarantine was invented. In 1665, there is what was called the Great Plague, in which 100,000 London citizens died in 7 months. Smallpox, when it was brought to the New World, because the indigenous population didn't have any resistance to it in some places, the indigenous peoples were wiped out. 90 to 95% of those populations. The Spanish flu, which was a variant of H1N1, 1918 to 1919, worldwide, estimated some 50 to 100 million worldwide, or million people died. That's about 3 times the number of people that died in World War I. Now, it's important to note that I am not saying God sent this plague directly as a punishment. I don't know what God is doing. I'm not saying God is punishing China. I'm not saying God is punishing the U.S. I'm not saying God is punishing our world. I don't know why this plague came about specifically. And it would be arrogant for me to try to say so. And I know there are preachers who are going to do that, but we're not. It was in 1773 that William Cowper penned these words: God moves in a mysterious way his wonders to perform. He plants his footsteps in the sea and rides upon the storm. Deep in unfathomable minds of never-failing skill, he treasures up his bright designs and works his sovereign will. Ye fearful saints, fresh courage take. The clouds ye so much dread are big with mercy and shall break with blessings on your head. Judge not the Lord by feeble sense, but trust him for his grace. Behind a frowning providence, there hides a smiling face. His purposes will ripen fast, unfolding every hour. The bud may have a bitter taste, but sweet will be the flower. Blind unbelief is sure to err and scan his work in vain. God is his own interpreter, and he will make it plain. I don't know why God allows specifically the things that he allows when he allows them, but I know this. And every Christian should know this. God's purposes are good. God favors man. God wants good for us. This is the very definition of grace. I cannot look at the cross and doubt God's favor toward man. The grace of God that bringeth salvation hath appeared to all men. Titus chapter 2, John 3:16, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. I cannot look at the cross and doubt God's favor toward man. We need to remember as we talk about this that Satan is also active in our world. 1 Peter 5 and verse 8, be sober, be vigilant, for your adversary the devil is a roaring lion, walketh about, seeking whom he may devour. I know why Satan sends things. I know his purpose is the opposite of God's. I know that he wants to bring us down. I know that he wants to discourage us. I know that he wants to distract us. I know that he wants us to live in the depths of despair. He wants to destroy us, and he wants to lead us to hell. In this lesson, we're going to be looking at 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verses 17 and 18. There Paul says, for our light affliction, which is but for a moment, worketh for us a far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory. When we look not at the things which are seen, but at the things which are not seen. For the things which are seen are temporal, but the things which are not seen are eternal. This great passage teaches us that our suffering is not in vain. It says our light affliction, which is but for a moment, worketh for us. That means it produces something. It is a productive thing. In fact, it produces wonderful things. I believe this is an elevator passage. It elevates our thinking. It elevates our affections so that we're not so attached to this world. And it elevates even our suffering and gives it a purpose and gives it a meaning so that our burdens become blessings and our heartaches give way to hope. In future lessons that I hope to be able to post, Lord willing, we will look at biblical stories that illustrate this great truth. We will see how others were elevated by their sufferings to great spiritual heights. So let's get out of the mud of despair. Let's climb to higher planes. Let's elevate. First, we need to acknowledge that 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verses 17 and 18 has a primary application to the apostles. It is the apostles that were made able ministers of the New Testament, chapter 3 and verse 6. The apostles had been given a special ministry, chapter 4 and verse 1. Paul was referring to the apostles when he said, death worketh in us, but life in you, in chapter 4 and verse 12. The apostles were chosen in a special way to be ambassadors for Christ, chapter 5 and verse 20. And it was the apostles in chapter 6, beginning in verse 4, who had been made to suffer in terrible ways to set an example for others. So death was working in them, but life works in us. But this passage cannot be limited to the apostles. And so many of the things that he says are obviously made to apply to all of us as we follow in their steps. And so we're on safe ground and looking at verses 17 and 18 and seeing that they also apply to us. We all live and minister under the New Testament. While we are not the same kind of ambassadors for Christ that they were, we represent Christ in this world. We all do. We are reflections of his glory. People see the gospel in us, and in that way we are ambassadors for Christ. And we are pleading with the world, be ye reconciled to God. We all have the gospel, the treasure, in earthen vessels. It's been given to men to preach the gospel to others. Chapter 4 and verse 7. In chapter 4 and verse 8, Paul refers to trouble and suffering in this world. And yet we know from 2 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 12 that all that will live godly in Christ Jesus shall suffer persecution. Like the apostles, when Paul said, we believe, therefore we speak. We all should have that same spirit of faith that he mentions there in chapter 4 and verse 13, so that we speak the things that we believe. All Christians look forward to and long for that day when this physical body will be clothed upon with a glorious body, an immortal body, a house not made with hands, as he describes it here in chapter 5, eternal in the heavens, like the apostles did. We all walk by faith and not by sight, chapter 5 and verse 7. The judgment mentioned in chapter 5 and verse 10 is for all men, not just for the apostles. And the love of Christ that he mentions in chapter 5 and verse 14, he says the love of Christ constrains us. It compels us. Well, it does that for all of us. It should be clear that this passage has application to all of us. Second thing I want us to notice about 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verses 17 and 18, is that this verse claims our affliction is light. It says something about our affliction or suffering. It says it's light and it's momentary. How can this be? In this very book, 2 Corinthians chapter 11, Paul lists some of the things that he had suffered for the cause of Christ. And they were not light things, folks. They were imprisonments, they were beatings, they were hunger and thirst and wakefulness and shipwreck and stoning and all of those things that he suffered for the cause of Christ. They don't seem, from our point of view, to be light things. How can he call them light things? If you have suffered the loss of a mate, the loss of a parent, the loss of a child, or other losses that come to us in this world, in various forms, it doesn't seem very light, does it? But this not only claims that our suffering is light, this verse claims that our suffering is but for a moment. If you are suffering from some painful condition, and maybe you've been suffering that way for months or years or even decades, how can it be just for a moment? Paul had suffered for years and had more suffering to come. And yet he says our light affliction, which is but for a moment. We need to understand this because he's drawing for us a specific contrast. He says our light affliction, which is but for a moment. It's light and it's temporary. He's contrasting that with a far more exceeding, not light, a heavy, a gloriously large, indescribably large, a far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory, not momentary, but the glory that's coming far outweighs the lightness of the sufferings. It makes it look light by comparison, and it is eternal. It is not momentary. I love the phrasing here that the Apostle Paul uses. It doesn't show up in our English very well, and I'm not a Greek teacher. I don't want to bog you down with thoughts of the Greek, but this word that is translated here, far more exceeding, is actually Paul repeating a word twice. And it's the word from which we get our word hyperbole, exaggeration for the sake of emphasis. You know, it's like when you tell your children, parents, you tell them, if I've told you once, I've told you 10 million times, don't exaggerate. Well, we are exaggerating for the sake of emphasis. This often happens, that people exaggerate for the sake of emphasis. Paul, in describing this glory and how weighty it is, he calls it hyperbole into hyperbole. The word hyperbole means to throw beyond. So he's saying that this glory is thrown beyond what is thrown beyond. It seems as though he's saying it cannot be over-exaggerated. The weight of this is so big, so overwhelming, that it makes any suffering we go through here in this life light by contrast. But there's something else that this verse claims about our suffering. Not just that it's light and momentary, but it claims that it is productive. Our light affliction, which is but for a moment, worketh for us. It produces for us. Its outcome for us is a far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory. While we look not at the things which are seen, we have to look beyond the coronavirus. We have to look beyond the difficulties that have come into our lives because of this virus and the restrictions on travel and the restrictions on gatherings and all those. We have to look beyond those because those are temporary things. And we have to look to that exceeding eternal weight of glory. That our suffering will produce for us. Thomas Warren used to call this world a vale of soul making. I'm sure he's not the only one that has ever used that phrase. And I know he's not the only one that has ever taught this principle. God uses the things of this world, the pain, the persecution, the suffering, the sorrow, the tears, the sickness, all of those things to prepare us for the glory which is to come. Picture, if you will, a stonemason. And he is building a huge, massive stone fireplace. And he's outside of the house and he's building the chimney that comes up the side of this house over top of this huge fireplace. And as you come up, you look and it's almost completed. And you look up toward the top and there's one gap there at the top of this chimney. But the stonemason's not up there. He's down on the ground. And he's holding in one hand a large stone and the other hand a hammer. And he's hitting this stone and he's chipping off pieces. And you say to him, does that stone fit in that gap? And he says, it will. I'm fitting it down here for its place up there. Things come to us in our life that are not fair. And they are often like hammer blows. And they strike us so that sometimes we don't know if we can continue on. But those hammer blows are producing for us a glory that is beyond exaggeration. Paul says in Romans 8 and verse 18, I reckon that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory which shall be revealed in Just as in the case with Job, Job chapters 1 and 2. Satan is trying to get us to turn against God, to curse God to his face, to be distracted by these setbacks and hurts and tears and difficulties here in this world. And God allows Satan to put these things in our lives. Why? I don't know the specifics. I don't know what he's trying to produce in you specifically, how he's trying to change you specifically. I do believe that these things work for our own well-being and that they work to help us help others. You remember in 2 Corinthians chapter 1, we're still in the same book here. But if we go back to the early verses of 2 Corinthians chapter 1, he talks about, "Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the God of all comfort, who comforteth us in all our tribulation," or our troubles, "that we may be able to comfort those who are in any trouble with the comfort wherewith we ourselves are comforted of God." When God allows us to face trouble and gives us comfort in that, then we can turn around and share that comfort with others. So maybe we're suffering certain things so that we can be prepared to help others. Maybe it's so that we can demonstrate to others a victorious faith, a joy that cannot be shaken, a contentment that is real regardless of what state we find ourselves in. Philippians chapter 4 and verse 11. But I know this, that all of these things that we suffer in this world are for good if we respond to them properly. In future lessons, we intend to, if the Lord allows us to look at Job and his situation. We can look at Joseph and the things that he suffered for a cause down the road somewhere. We can look at John 9 and answer the question of why the man was born blind and had to suffer as a blind man for so many years. And we can answer without any doubts the question of why Jesus allowed his friend Lazarus, whom he loved, to die, and then stood beside his grave weeping. We can see from the suffering of others the good things that can be produced by suffering. But in closing this lesson, let's stick with the Apostle Paul. And let's, in fact, stick with 2 Corinthians. And let's go over to chapter 12, verses 7 through 10. There Paul says, "And lest I should be exalted above measure through the abundance of the revelations, there was given to me a thorn in the flesh, the messenger of Satan, to buffet me, lest I should be exalted above measure. For this thing I besought the Lord thrice, that it might depart from me. And he said unto me, My grace is sufficient for thee, for my strength is made perfect in weakness." So Paul concludes this, "Most gladly, therefore, will I rather glory in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. Therefore I take pleasure in infirmities and reproaches, in necessities, in persecutions, in distresses for Christ's sake. For when I am weak, then am I strong." What a powerful passage in helping us to deal with the problems of pain and human suffering. We don't know what this thorn in the flesh was that Paul had. Some suggest his eyesight, other problems that he could have had. We don't know. But I know this, that thorn in the flesh was a messenger of Satan. Satan gave it to him. Satan wanted to distract him. Satan wanted to buffet him. Satan wanted to keep him from accomplishing his purpose here in the cause of Christ. And God allowed it. God allowed Satan to give him this thorn in the flesh. Why? To keep Paul from being exalted above measure. Paul was arguably, very possibly, the greatest ambassador for Christ in the New Testament age. He wrote a large portion of the New Testament. He established churches everywhere he went. He trained preachers. And God doesn't want him to be lifted up with pride. God didn't want him to be exalted above measure. And so he allowed Satan to buffet him. And Paul learned from this. You see, God didn't just allow it. God refused to take it away. Paul asked him 3 times, please take this away. And he said, I've given you enough. And my strength is made perfect in weakness. And Paul learned from that. He said, there's glory to be found. There's joy to be found in troubles, in persecutions, in distresses, in necessities, and all of these things that we suffer here in this world. Because they cause us to rely on God. They remind us that we are completely dependent on him and that our strength comes from him, not from ourselves. He said, I want the power of Christ, not my own strength. You know, when the wind blows out on a lake or the sea or some body of water, you can watch 2 different sailboats going in opposite directions on the same wind. You ever notice that? Because the difference is how the sailor sets the sails. The winds of adversity blow in our lives. And it makes all the difference in the world how we set our sails. Are we going to allow these things to drive us away from God? Or are we going to allow these things to drive us further and further into his care, into his arms, into his love, into his service? Are we going to allow these things to elevate us to higher ground? We can be blown off course, or we can draw near to God. So I challenge you today to elevate your thinking. Whatever you're suffering, it can cause you to rely on God and be closer to him. Let's refuse to live in the mud and mire of despair. Instead, let's use even our suffering as a stepping stone to higher ground. Elevate, rising above the sufferings of this world.